Hello, everyone. I'm here with my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the week's major developments in Palestine. Hi, Mouin. How are you doing?
Hello, Nassim. Very good to be with you as always.
Likewise, we will begin, as always, with this situation unfolding in Gaza. But I just wanted to start with an observation from the past week. And one of the striking developments, which we'll get to later on, is just the sheer number of people who've suddenly discovered, they've got some conscience and they found some conscience from somewhere, and now they are opposing Israel's genocide. And that observation um, was interesting. And there was a number of commentators on social media, and there's one line that I thought was interesting and I want to share before we begin our conversation, which is that there is no way to run a successful PR campaign for a genocide. And I thought that really um, explained what we are seeing over the past week or two. That really, despite all its effort, all its propaganda and hasbara, there is just no way to run a successful PR campaign for genocide, and which is a topic which we'll get to later on. But I want to begin, as I mentioned, with the situation in Gaza. But before we speak about the so-called humanitarian encampments run by Israelis and American mercenaries, I want to get your thoughts first on the latest on the so-called peace agreement, ceasefire negotiation that is taking place between Hamas and well, it's not Israel so much, but with the Americans that they're discussing this ceasefire agreement. The There are a number of things to observe. First of all, the talks have been led by, as I'm led to believe, by someone called Bishara Bahba. He is a
Correct.
Palestinian American who led the group Arab Americans for Trump during the 2024 campaign. That's an interesting development. Maybe you can comment on that as well, and the general and how the ceasefire talks are progressing between Hamas and the Americans. Not Israel, it seems, but the Americans.
Well, Bishara Bahbah is a Palestinian American Republican and was actively involved in Palestinian or Arab Americans for Trump during the recent US presidential election campaign. He's a Harvard graduate. He obtained his doctorate from Harvard and, in fact, wrote his thesis on Israeli relations with Latin American terror regimes during the 1970s and 1980s. And it seems that at some point during the past few months, Hamas or figures in the Trump administration or both reached out to him to serve as an intermediary between Washington and Hamas after Israel leaked and sabotaged the direct discussions that the U.S. hostage envoy Adam Buller had been conducting with Hamas. Now, negotiations about a potential new agreement or a revival of the January agreement, which the incoming Trump administration imposed on Israel at the time. These negotiations have been ongoing. And what appears to have happened is that in recent weeks, Bahbah has been serving as a conduit once again for communications between the Hamas leadership and the Trump administration, specifically its effective Secretary of State, as I like to call him, Steve Witkoff, and the U.S. hostage envoy, Adam Buller. And it appears that they agreed on a set of basic principles for a new agreement. Um, for the US, the priority is an agreement that leads to the release of all remaining captives in the Gaza Strip. For Hamas, the priority is an end to Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, a withdrawal of all Israeli forces from the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and of course, an immediate and unrestricted surge of essential supplies to the population of the Gaza Strip. And they appear to have found a formula that includes some elements of what is called constructive ambiguity, that appears to have satisfied both sides. Now, again, these were American Palestinian negotiations. Witkoff then took the draft agreement to the Israelis. The Israelis, for whom the absolute priority is avoiding any agreement that brings its military campaign to a formal end, rejected it. And in a recollection, if you will, of the Biden administration's interaction with this file, and also for that matter, Witkoff in February of this year, the Americans then turned around and blamed Hamas for rejecting an agreement while also claiming that Israel had accepted it. There are some suggestions about a miscommunication that Bahbah miscommunicated core US requirements to Hamas and that Hamas agreed to something different than what the Americans were proposing. But I would take that with a grain of salt because Bahbah's role is very clear. He's only the messenger. He's not formulating proposals on behalf of either the Americans or the Palestinians. So the ball is now very much in the U.S. president's court, in Donald Trump's court. Will he allow this draft agreement to collapse with the obvious ramification of a further intensification of Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, or will he use his authority as the leader of the U.S. to make that one phone call to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and say there's a deal on the table. It meets our requirements. The Palestinians have agreed to it. It meets your requirements, and now you have no choice but to implement it. I think Israel's main problem is that while it is true that confronting genocide or preventing famine are not U.S. policies and certainly not U.S. priorities, and that Netanyahu and his government and his military have been given a very long leash to achieve their objectives. I think the problem for Israel is that it continues to fail. It is unable to achieve a decisive outcome in the Gaza Strip, and therefore time may be running out. It doubtlessly promised the Americans, if you just give us 1 more month, 2 more months, we'll achieve what we've failed to achieve during the past 18 months. And the Americans probably agreed to this and are now looking at the situation on the ground. There's still fighting going on immediately across from the Israeli-Gaza boundary, which Israel has now conquered God knows how many times. And then on the other side of the equation, which we'll be discussing later, this effort to provide an alternative to the United Nations and other aid agencies has been a total failure. In fact, today, Monday, is collapsing into total pandemonium.
Yeah, before we get to that, I want to just stay on the negotiations at the moment. You mentioned Trump. There seems to be an attempt by Hamas to bypass Qatar and Egypt. They want to have their own channel directly with the Americans. But the question still remains, how far can even Trump push this? He's trying all these different formulas, and in this case, he's brought in an Arab American Palestinian. But as we've seen over the past 19 months, it doesn't matter what formula, what combination one uses. The bottom line is that Netanyahu isn't seeking to end the war. Netanyahu isn't seeking to even bring the hostages back. It seems like his main priority is the annihilation and the destruction of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza. So how much can even Trump do with all these new formulas and new negotiations that he's insisting on? But it seems like even Trump isn't willing to do what's required to force Netanyahu to do what's required to end this genocide.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with your characterization that Hamas is seeking to bypass the Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Quite clearly, they now have a more direct, albeit apparently still indirect line to the Americans. But I'm quite sure that they're keeping both the Qataris and the Egyptians fully informed and up to date on developments. And after all, it was the Qataris who enabled and hosted the direct talks held between the US and Hamas in the Qatari capital, Doha, a few months ago. And I think what would be very useful now, although I can't imagine it happening, would be for Bashar al-Bahbah, or for that matter, the Egyptians and Qataris, to give a readout of what actually happened. You know, during the Biden years, Biden and Blinken and Jake Sullivan and other senior US officials were repeatedly coming to the podium and feeding us bald-faced lies that they knew were lies about what was actually happening and not happening in the negotiations, constantly claiming falsely that Israel had accepted what it had rejected and that Hamas had rejected what it had accepted. And this, of course, provided a more permissive environment, certainly as far as US and Western policy was concerned, for the continuation of the genocidal military campaign. And in that context, I think it would be useful for those in the know to now just give a readout. You know, we have all these contradictory claims. Well, which are true and which are false? But again, I don't see that happening, because for all of them, I think their priority is to maintain their relations with Washington rather than anything to do with the situation on the ground in the Gaza Strip. As far as Trump, yes, of course, the U.S. does, rather Israel and its lobby do have influence in Washington, most certainly in Congress, and they also, you know, have their loyalists and minions at senior levels of the U.S. administration. But at the end of the day, the United States is a superpower and Israel is a proxy. And if Trump genuinely wanted Israel to accept this draft agreement, it literally would take no more than a single phone call from Trump to Netanyahu informing him, this is what you're going to do, or else. And we saw that, for example, very clearly most recently in January, where it took just one meeting between Steve Witkoff and the Israeli Prime Minister to compel Israel to accept and to begin implementing what it had been rejecting for over a year. Unfortunately, of course, in February, the United States then tried to rewrite the agreement that was already being implemented and permitted Israel to basically abort it. But, you know, the lesson stands. Israel does as it's told when the United States decides that a certain course of action by Israel is required to meet basic US interests.
And let's turn our attention to the other big story, which we've been speaking about here and hearing about for a number of weeks, the Israeli-run new aid regime, which is going to be manned by mercenaries, and from what I've read, number of ex-ISIS members, warlords, and drug dealers who are actually manning some of the areas in Gaza as well. It faces first big hurdle this week. The head of the plan, his name is, I think, Jake Wood. He resigned, saying that the operation could not fulfill its mission in a way that adhered to humanitarian principles. And what we've learned over the past week is that the funding of this new aid regime, which bypasses the UN and all other aid organizations, is unclear. The UN has opposed it, saying that it goes against international law and a number of other reasons it's cited. So we are, as I said, we are recording on Tuesday, and this story is unfolding. There's a number of events on the ground that's happened today, Tuesday, the 27th of May. So do you want to go through that, Mouin? And keeping in mind, as I said, that it's an unfolding story regarding the new so-called humanitarian aid regime that's been installed by Israel.
Yes, as you mentioned, we're speaking on Tuesday, and I suspect that by the time this video airs, this entire effort will no longer exist, and I'll explain why. As you mentioned, Israel, in collusion with the United States, concocted this fraudulent scheme with the Orwellian name of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Apparently, this initiative has been over a year in the making, and what the Israelis and Americans decided, primarily the Israelis, of course, is that they could hit two birds with one stone. The first being to eliminate the role of international aid agencies in the Gaza Strip, and thinking primarily, of course, of UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestine refugees, but also all the others we've been hearing about during the past several years, World Central Kitchen, Norwegian Refugee Council, and all the rest of them, basically to sideline them and replace them with with a quote unquote aid mechanism that is in fact an appendage of not only the Israeli military, but also an appendage of Israel's strategy towards the Gaza Strip. And what this Orwellian named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was supposed to do was to set up a limited number of distribution centers in the south of the Gaza Strip so that any Palestinian, and bear in mind, since March 2nd, not a grain of wheat, not a loaf of bread, not a drop of fuel, not a drop of water has entered the Gaza Strip, absolutely no medicine or whatever. And any Palestinian who was sufficiently desperate to acquire these essential supplies needed for sustenance and survival would have to make the trek to the southern Gaza Strip, go through a number of Israeli checkpoints where, of course, all their information would be taken and they could be kidnapped or held hostage at will, then receive a package of basic supplies that would last 1 week, return to wherever they wanted to take those, and then have to repeat the exercise on a weekly basis. And the idea was basically to create a series of concentration camps, as they were more or less explicitly called by those responsible for the scheme, as a prelude to pushing the entire population out of the Gaza Strip. Um, Now, when you have exorbitantly paid mercenaries resigning and resigning sanctimoniously citing humanitarian principles, which clearly they never gave a hoot about, then you know you're in trouble. And what happened is this past week, the scheme's executive director, who was essentially appointed by the Israeli military, an American mercenary, and I think a former sniper, so someone who probably has quite a lot of blood on his hands even before he started. I think his name is Jake Wood. Um, Resigned, claiming, that he suddenly came to the realization that this entire scheme violated every elementary principle of humanitarian aid, whether neutrality, whether the idea of, taking supplies to the desperate population rather than making them walk for kilometers to get it. And of course, many people are simply incapable of doing so. But nevertheless, after additional delays, presumably to make the desperate population even more desperate, this Orwellian named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose purpose is to restrict rather than provide aid, established one of its first distribution centers in Rafah, in the extreme south of the Gaza Strip. According to reports from, again, Tuesday morning, just before we began our discussion, it was complete pandemonium. These people have no idea what they're doing. They're their experience is in being mercenaries rather than humanitarian workers. And what happened is they had insufficient supplies. Um, Large crowds of desperate Palestinian civilians surged into this center to seek to acquire anything they could. Um, and the result was such pandemonium that even these heavily armed US mercenaries recruited by the genocidal apartheid state ended up fleeing the distribution center and had to do so under covering fire from Israeli snipers and US supplied Israeli helicopter gunships. There are additional reports that as these civilians were making their way by foot to the distribution center, that they had to provide all kinds of biometric and other information, that a number of them were kidnapped and are now being kept hostage by the Israeli military, and will presumably be put into its torture system. And just one last point, which you raised about ISIS. Yes, there have been persistent reports of two related issues. On the one hand, Israel has been systematically targeting any remnants of the government in Gaza on the pretext that these are Hamas, and any remnants of the police force that was seeking to secure aid and its distribution. At the same time, it was also collaborating with certain militias in the southern Gaza Strip, whose leaders are known to be aligned in one way or another with ISIS, arming them and basically ensuring that it was they who would loot all the aid that would come in. And of course, the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra turns around and says, well, all this was necessary to ensure that Hamas would stop looting aid. Well, all the available evidence shows that there's no need to stop Hamas from looting aid because Hamas has not been looting aid. In fact, Hamas has been working, or the government rather, has been working to secure aid. And the most recent evidence we have in this respect is that of Cindy McCain, the executive director of the World Food Program, if I'm not mistaken, the daughter of easily one of the top five most pro-Israeli figures in U.S. history, John McCain. And she was asked on one of the Sunday news shows in the U.S., Face the Nation, I believe, whether there is any evidence that Hamas has been looting aid. And she answered that with, I think, two words, no and never.
And it was quite clear from the beginning, I think, that the motivation for this is not humanitarian. It is really another continuation of the use of starvation and famine as a weapon of war. And the goal is to move Palestinians or entice Palestinians from the north to the south and put them into the concentration camps, which we've discussed in previous shows, and ultimately with the end game of forcing Palestinians out. That seems to be the overriding
Yes.
motivation here. It is nothing to do with
Yeah.
providing humanitarian aid or the 3 million or so meals that this so-called aid organization is going to be distributing. It's got
Well,
nothing to do with that.
if I can paraphrase von Clausewitz, for Israel, starvation is a continuation of war by other means. I mean, it's absolutely transparent, and the reason it's absolutely transparent is that the Israeli leadership, those who are responsible for this policy, have been telling us black on white. But of course, Israel's apologists and flunkies claim that none of this is happening, even as Israel's leadership is telling us not only this is exactly what's happening, but this is happening because this is what they are seeking, um, uh, what they are seeking to achieve. It's really beyond words. If Israel's apologists and flunkies are to be believed, yes, there is a comprehensive siege on the Gaza Strip. The only people suffering from this are, of course, armed Hamas combatants. But The civilian population, according to them, has never had it better. It's just, getting back to the point you made in the introduction, it's a hard sell. Granted, Israel's messengers are increasingly low quality. Israel really is scraping the bottom of the barrel. But you could get the best public relations firms on earth, and they wouldn't be able to convincingly sell, the message that burning children alive, that starving an entire population is actually a good thing we should support.
And you mentioned Cindy McCain, who rejected the idea that Hamas is stealing food. During the past week, also, the ex-Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, he came out in an article in the Haaretz in Hebrew, I think. He said that Israel is conducting a war of annihilation. I mean, we've been saying that from day one. Now, slowly, a number of other Israeli officials and senior officials, the ministers, have come out and said that as well. And this follows statements from the UK, joint statement by UK, France, and Canada last week, which we discussed on the show. Many were not, of course, convinced by that. Most people felt that this was really whitewashing their role in the genocide and trying to clean their blood-soaked hands off of the genocide itself. And there was an interesting article in The Guardian by Nasreen Malik, and the
Yes.
title I thought was really interesting. She said that the way the world talks about Israel has changed, but nothing else has actually changed. So on the ground, there isn't any really effective action being taken to stop Israel and Netanyahu from continuing with their genocide. So going back to my original point, it is difficult, impossible to sell a genocide. There is no PR company that can sell a genocide to the world, and we are seeing that. But and we are seeing more and more people who you'd think wouldn't are now supporting the side that are describing what Israel is doing as a genocide, like Olmert and so many others. So just get your thoughts on the fact that there is, as Nasrin Malik mentioned, that the way we talk about Israel has changed, but there isn't really anything effective being done. An example of that is David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary. He announced when the statement was issued, joint statement, that trade negotiations with Israel will be suspended. But as he tweeted that, Ian Austin, who is a UK's trade envoy to Israel, he tweeted that he is in Israel meeting with business leaders, and they are discussing promoting trade between the UK and Israel. So within seconds of Lammy saying what he said, condemning Israel and whatnot, the UK trade envoy to Israel undermines him by tweeting something else, saying that he's in Israel discussing with firms and Israeli companies. So I guess Nazrin's title of her article is very astute and honest.
Well, it's right on target, and Nasreen Malik's recent Guardian opinion piece, and she's written so many outstanding ones. This is undoubtedly one of the best, particularly because it turns out, I think it was published the day before we found out, if I can put it in polite French, that David Lammy was full of shit and knowingly lying to Parliament about suspending these trade talks. The credibility of British officials going back centuries for that matter, and regarding Palestine, certainly from the moment Great Britain first got involved in the Palestine question, their credibility is as bad, if not, if this can be even possible, worse than that of Israeli officials. They couldn't transparently tell the truth if their lives depended on it. Now, regarding Ehud Olmert, excuse me, I think it's a very interesting case. Olmert, as you may know, was the Israeli prime minister in 2008 during Operation Cast Lead, the first major Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip after Israel's 2005 disengagement from the territory. and of course was an attack replete with war crimes and crimes against humanity that were all um, um, detailed in an excruciating manner in the well-known Goldstone report, which still stands even though its author, Richard Goldstone, tried to pretend that none of what he said was true, but it's just overwhelmingly documented. And he has now come out and stated that Israel is not only perpetrating war crimes in the Gaza Strip, but is engaged in a war of extermination or war of annihilation. I'm not sure which phrase he used. My understanding is that he wrote this for the Hebrew edition of Haaretz, but this article, or at least a version of it, is now also available on the website of the English language edition of that Israeli newspaper. And a few days previously, we had a statement by an Israeli opposition leader, Yair Golan, um, pointing out, as others have over decades, that Israel is killing children as a hobby. He should know he was formerly a senior Israeli general and presumably engaged happily in this hobby himself during his years of service. And I think these statements are important. You know, some people would like to dismiss them because they're being made by war criminals, because we don't need Israeli validation to know what's been staring us in the face and all the rest of it. Well, all of that may be true, but at the same time, when people from inside the Israeli elite began parroting what has been, as you noted, been obvious for a year, and what every major human rights organization and genocide specialist and so on has been saying, I think it's politically significant. Perhaps not for you and me, but when you look at these cowardly politicians and officials who have been trying to look the other way for the past 18 months while sending arms to Israel and so on, it makes it more difficult for them to sustain their position. And if they're sitting on the fence, it makes it a little easier for them to come out and begin stating the obvious. The situation we have here is that is European officials in particular are now being caught between the hammer of increasingly large demonstrations by their own citizens. We had massive ones in the past week in Amsterdam and London and elsewhere. Um, they're caught between the hammer of the growing schism between official policy and public opinion on the one hand, and the anvil of this constant stream of increasingly genocidal statements by the most senior Israeli leaders. And it's making it impossible for them to continue with business as usual, or at least making it more difficult for them to continue with business as usual. And then when you have Israeli leaders like Olmert and Golan, who enjoy more respect with many of these officials than the crew currently in charge of the Israeli government, I think that can be politically significant, and I think it should be mobilized to generate further pressure on these Western governments.
And I think you mentioned European officials. The European Union itself is guilty of this, speaking about changing the way it speaks about Israel, but really doing nothing about the situation on the ground. And I say that because the EU top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, she said that we need to put pressure on Israel to stop the situation on the ground. And now, and I'm of and I'm led to believe, well, I've read an opinion which shows that the EU is actually sitting on a confidential review of how Israel is in violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law, and it's shared with all its. This report is shared with all its members, but it has never acted upon this, or the Commission has never acted upon this report. So this idea again, changing the language, saying we need to do something about this, we need to put pressure on Israel. The EU knows or has known for many months, based on its own research, that what Israel is doing is violating international humanitarian law, and if so,
Exactly.
that it needs to stop funding Israel, it needs to stop its aid and trade with Israel. So, I mean, I guess maybe you can just go through some of the statements that have been issued over the past months about the EU and how two-faced, hypocritical it's been, and how it's again it's so slow. And again, it's another example of
Yes.
the way we talk about Israel has changed, but nothing else has.
Yes. Yeah. The tone has certainly changed. The dam is broken as far as tone is concerned. But it is not that European leaders and officials are suddenly coming out against genocide. Far from it. They still refuse to acknowledge that a genocide has been taking place on their watch with their support. So they're focusing much more on, let's call it the humanitarian file of, you can't starve millions of people to death. This has to stop and so on, but not yet taking the necessary position that this is a genocide. Because if it's a genocide, then you're also under very clear legal obligations, not only to punish, but also prevent. Now, as far as the European Union is concerned, so in 2000, what's known as the EU-Israel Association Agreement came into force. It's basically an agreement that gives Israel preferential trade privileges with the European Union. It treats Israel in many ways as if it were a member of the European Union, and gives it access to very lucrative research programs and so on. And Article 2 of the Association Agreement obliges Israel to respect human rights. I don't have the precise wording in front of me, but basically makes the agreement dependent on Israeli respect for human rights. This was in 2000. We're now in 2025. And what that means is that for the past 25 years, the European Union has been unable to determine whether Israel is or is not violating Palestinian human rights. The European Union, as of 2025, hasn't a clue whether settlements in the occupied territories are legal or illegal, despite what they say. The European Union doesn't have a clue about whether genocide is a good or a bad thing. The European Union still doesn't know whether products produced in Israeli settlements should or should not be allowed into the European market, because they're still flooding the European market, and they're what making the settlement enterprise viable. European Union still hasn't been able to decide whether the acquisition of territory by war, whether the annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights is legal or illegal, at least when one considers um, that that Article 2 of the European Union of the EU-Israel Association Agreement has never been invoked in order to confront Israel and sanction it under this agreement. The only conclusion can be that the European Union simply is unable to determine whether Israel is indeed the most moral army and state in the universe, or whether it is indeed the genocidal apartheid state that every serious person and organization who has looked into this question has concluded. Now, under, again, the growing pressure of public opinion, and I would argue also growing pressure from within its own bureaucracy and among some of its own officials, as Hugh Lovat of the European Council of Foreign Relations has pointed out, the EU did, in fact, last year conduct a review of Israel's compliance with Article 2 of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, the Human Rights Clause I was just talking about. And as you mentioned, the review was carried out confidentially and came to absolutely damning conclusions. That much we know. The review itself, I think, has not yet been leaked. The difference this time is that the review is being conducted, is not being conducted confidentially, and presumably its conclusions will at some point have to be made public. But let's be clear, the direction of travel of Brussels and of most of the EU's member governments, and certainly of Great Britain as well, the direction of travel is and remains business as usual. I mean, the idea, that in the midst of the genocide, the EU needs to even consider whether or not Israel is complying with its human rights obligations, and that an investigation is needed to determine this, shows quite clearly that they have absolutely no intention of changing their policy unless left with no other choice and forced to do so.
Let's turn our attention to the tragic shooting last week, the Israeli embassy in Washington. So, of course, attacks of that nature should be condemned, and that goes without saying. But what was interesting is just the way in which pro-Israelis and supporters of Israel use that to peddle, I would say, the narrative that this is somehow another example of the anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli sentiments, and anti-Jewish sentiments across the world and in the US, forgetting the fact that the two that were killed were not, first of all, were not Jews. That's one thing to mention. And also, I guess what I want you to speak about is just to look at the motivation of the person who carried out the killing, Elias Rodriguez. He was quite clear in why he carried out the attack. He left a manifesto, and in the manifesto, he cited the genocide in Gaza as his motivation, that there has been a global failure in his view to stop the genocide. He cites Bushnell, who
Aaron
um,
Bushnell, yes.
Aaron Bushnell, who self-immolated himself again because of what he saw in Palestine, in Gaza. And this is part of a long tradition where number of people have burnt themselves to bring attention to the genocide and the killing that's been happening in Vietnam, and of course more recently in the case of the Arab Spring. Bouzazi, he did the same thing as well. I guess, I mean, the motivation could not be clear. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. If you want to describe it as something, it's political killing. You can maybe call it terrorism if you want to, but it definitely isn't anti-Semitism that motivated Elias Rodriguez, and it kind of undermines the propagandists who want to, sell this idea that anyone who opposes Israel's genocide is anti-Semitic, and this is the kind of killing that it leads to. So, in their eyes, you and I are somehow guilty of the killing of the two Israeli embassy staff.
Yeah, it's quite an extraordinary incident. If this gunman, Elias Rodriguez,
Rodriguez.
if he had walked into a synagogue or a school or a Jewish community center and started shooting people up, then it would be indisputable that this was an act of vile and violent anti-Semitism, motivated by the pernicious view that Jews are individually and collectively responsible for Israel's actions. Or he could, even putting his statement aside, that he was simply motivated, could have been motivated by traditional anti-Semitism, which means that one has an irrational hatred of Jews simply on the basis of their identity and nothing else. What happened here is quite different. I believe this was an event that was convened by the American Jewish Committee, a once venerable organization that has completely sold its soul to Zionism and Israel in recent decades. So that alone would tell you that this person most likely had a political motive rather than this being a hate crime. Of course, it would also be possible that someone would identify this meeting as a place where Jews would be and could have gone in simply because he wants to shoot and kill Jews. But that wasn't the case here. He went there because of the political character of this event. And more importantly, according to the Israeli ambassador to the United States, he entered the event and identified these two people as staff of the Israeli embassy and later singled them out for his act of killing because they were staff of the Israeli embassy. Now, it doesn't matter what you think of his actions, but to in any way characterize what appears to be a targeted assassination, a deliberate liquidation of two individuals because of their role, to then turn around and say, oh, this is Jew hatred. The only reason these people were killed is because they're Jewish, even though one of them isn't even Jewish, is absolutely absurd. You know, if this guy had no idea who he was targeting, and it later turned out that one of them was not Jewish, well, then you could say anti Semitism was still the motivation. But that wasn't at all the case here. This was a targeted assassination, according to the Israeli ambassador, of two individuals who the shooter knew to be staff of the Israeli embassy and shot and killed for that reason. That at least is the version that's being put forward by the Israeli ambassador to the United States. Whether one takes his word on it or not, I leave up to you. But even more importantly, before the bodies even went cold, you know, the Haspara Symphony Orchestra, in unison, erupted into one of its favorite concertos. Not only was this an act of anti Semitism motivated by Jew hatred and nothing else, but anyone who has ever uttered a word of criticism of Israel is responsible for pulling the trigger. You know, two birds with one stone again. I mean, the absolute absurdity that anyone who opposes genocide is somehow responsible for a murder in Washington. Um, you know, absolutely shameless, immediately exploiting the killing of these two people in order to demonize, in order to smear, in order to delegitimize people who are standing up for human rights, people who are standing up against genocide and mass murder and all the rest of it. Absolutely shameless, but you know, um, hardly the most shameless thing Israel flunkies and apologists have engaged in recent years.
Yeah, and talking about genocide, and we mentioned this phrase before, genocide mania. Not a week
Yeah,
goes by when we don't see evidence of that in Israeli society. I mean,
very much so.
there was a poll that was carried out last week in Israel, and it showed that 82% of Israelis support the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and 56% support the ethnic cleansing of Arab or Palestinian Israelis. That I mean
Palestinian citizens of
that
Israel,
yeah, that was
but
quite
there is no
shocking.
apartheid. Yeah,
Yeah. Um, uh, so we see these polls and we get a sense of what Israeli society is. And just the other day, there was a barbecue in next to the Gaza Strip by Israelis. So as Palestinians are starving, some Israelis are holding a barbecue there. And again, I guess it's a reflection of the kind of mindset that's taken hold of Israeli society. Um, but our politicians, like Lamy, like Starmer, and many others, will say, no, the problem really is Benjamin Netanyahu,
yeah.
and if only we can get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, it will all be fine. Um, but they're not willing to admit the fact that what we're dealing with is really a deep rot within Israeli society itself. It doesn't matter if Netanyahu is there or not there, but deep down there is a issue with Israeli society which looks at Palestinians in such a dehumanized way, or they've been propagandized and they've been radicalized to think about Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in such a way that it makes genocide a logical outcome in their mindset?
Israel has become a genocidal society in which hysterical genocide mania, as you put it, Nassim, a few weeks ago, sets the tone of public discourse in Israel. Does that mean that each and every Israeli citizen is somehow guilty and responsible for the actions of their genocidal apartheid state? Of course not. But it's perfectly legitimate, I think, at this stage, to characterize the society as a genocidal society. And what you've just indicated are just a few of an absolute multitude of examples in this case. I mean, let's take just um, yesterday, Monday, what the Israelis call Jerusalem Day. First, thousands of settlers break into the Haram al-Sharif and start engaging in their genocide dance, jumping up and down like maniacal fanatics and so on. Then they storm through Arab East Jerusalem, and particularly the Old City, um, uttering their two favorite slogans, death to the Arabs. And we're talking about thousands of people um, doing this under police protection, with police actually participating with them. And the video is there to see, chanting their favorite slogans, death to the Arabs and may your village burn. And this happens every year. What's different this year is that The Guardian, British newspaper The Guardian, headline described this as a racist march. I don't think that the newspaper has done so on previous occasions in recent years, though I could be wrong. But I believe this is the first time they've actually called it by its proper name. And there are so many examples. We've talked about these over the months. But I think the conclusion that Israel has become a genocidal society is inescapable, and that, of course, is why they put so much effort into making you believe that it's actually the Palestinians who are committing genocide here, while Israel is the most moral army in the solar system, if not, the universe in its entirety.
And that's also why I think they doubled down on their PR campaign. Somehow they can put a lipstick on the genocide and make it right. It doesn't work that way. And talking about the West Bank, as you mentioned, there is the flag march where they're chanting "Death to Arabs." Gaza is ours. We will burn your village. Things like that. And this annual hate fest is state supported, in the sense that the state security forces, Israeli security forces, protect the settlers that march through Arab villages. Last week, also in the West Bank, settlers rampaged through burning cars. And today, Tuesday, the 27th, Israel launched a large-scale security operation against money exchange offices in the occupied West
And
Bank
jewelers.
and jewelers. So, I mean, we've not really touched upon or spoken about the West Bank for a couple of weeks, but situation there again, it's it's getting worse, and it's another example of where the issue isn't just the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, we see genocide mania taking root and expelling Palestinians, which is why I wanted to get your thoughts on just what is happening in the West Bank, and if you can provide some details of that.
Well, it's at a significantly lower level of intensity than the Gaza Strip. We have seen an intensification of destruction of infrastructure, of depopulation of certain areas, a growing number of pogroms conducted, not by the settlers or even by the settlers acting under the protection of the military, but by the settlers and the military throughout the West Bank. And I think it's important to know that for Israel, the key prize is the West Bank and an ability to formally annex the West Bank. And what's interesting here, and I'm sure we'll be discussing it next month, is that France has indicated that it is considering recognizing Palestinian statehood at this conference it is convening together with Saudi Arabia in New York at the end of June. And apparently, the message from Israel has been, if you do this, we are going to formally annex the West Bank. It's not much of a threat to formalize what in practice you've already done, and what will make it even more difficult for these European governments that are desperate to continue with business as usual with Israel because they passionately believe in Israel. They see Israel as one of theirs, as the Tory leader Kemi Badenoch said earlier this week. Israel is fighting a proxy war on our behalf. And I genuinely believe that if you were to conduct a poll among the European political class, that is probably the majority view. But getting back to the West Bank, that is for Israel the real prize. The annexation, the depopulation, the expanded settlement of the West Bank.
Let's end on a development in Lebanon. Apparently, Palestinians in Lebanon are about to give up their weapons. There's a negotiation that's taking place with Mahmoud Abbas and Joseph Aoun, and they are seeking to disarm Palestinians. So this is happening while Israel is still continuing to bomb Lebanon. So what's the background to this story, and are Palestinians in Lebanon likely to surrender their weapons?
Very unlikely to happen for the simple reason that the majority of weapons held by Palestinians in Lebanon are not held by groups and individuals loyal to Mahmoud Abbas. So, his systematic neglect of Palestinians in Lebanon over the decades has now created a situation where he, unlike Yasser Arafat, for example, in previous decades, he cannot impose his will on the Palestinians of Lebanon. Having said that, it may be the case that these groups decide, for reasons of their own, having to do with their relations with the Lebanese government and perhaps growing pressure from the Lebanese government to demilitarize in significant part. But Mahmoud Abbas is basically irrelevant to this story. I think what is actually happening here is that Abbas has been sent to Lebanon to serve as a precedent in the sense that if you can get a formal agreement with Abbas to demilitarize the Palestinians in Lebanon, well, then that can then be used as a precedent to also demand the demilitarization and disarmament of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Of course, these are two entirely different situations. And if that is indeed the thinking behind those who came up with this idea of bringing someone who has no power over Lebanon's Palestinians to sign off on their disarmament and demilitarization. If in the larger scheme of things, the real target here is actually Hezbollah, it's a rather curious way of going about things.
And we will, of course, keep an eye on that story. And if should anything come up, we'll cover that, I guess, next week or the week after. Thank you, Mouin. As always, a pleasure talking to you. And thank you for tuning in.
Likewise, Nassim. Thank you very much.
See you all next week. Bye-bye.